You're very open about your intersectional identities as someone who is blind, someone who is a racialized, a person of color, someone who is queer. Can you talk a little bit about how your intersectionality informs your work as a disability inclusion advocate, but also is important for us to understand in the context of creating environments that are rooted in belonging for people who live with disabilities through an intersectional lens?
Oh, I love it. So many layers. I love it. So first, my shout out to my forever icon teacher hero, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality in 1989. And the concept of intersectionality is essentially that people don't experience forms of oppression, othering, or inclusion along a linear pathway. So identities and experiences intersect. So, for example, in my case, my identity as a racialized person intersects with my identity as a queer person, which intersects with my identity as a disabled person. And that makes my experience singularly different than people who might be, for example, only racialized or only queer or only disabled. But I, for example, will never understand the experience of a woman with a disability who's racialized or indigenous or queer or Black, like their identities and lived experiences that I don't have. So I also won't understand that. So the goal of intersectionality is help us understand how circles of oppression and identity intersect, and what is the role of policy and programming and advocacy to make sure we include everybody in the solutions that we're developing. And so for me, this is really personal because I have to say, as someone who is racialized and queer, I've often found that disabled voices, disabled experiences are excluded from those advocacy movements in really tangible ways. So, for example, going to Pride and having events that are inaccessible, not having the conversation about people with disabilities in the LGBTQ2 plus environment, what it means for us to be and belong in those spaces is often excluded. In racialized communities, disability, I know in the South Asian community sometimes is looked at in a very pejorative way. People speak about my experience as the result of generational trauma or ills or wrongs that my family has made, and I have to navigate what that looks like. So in addition to being excluded, sometimes there's oppressive commentary sent my way. But I also have to say that the disability community sometimes can be very monolithic in its experience as well. So, for example, racial identity, queer identity, gender identity is not intersected in all of the disability rights programming we're seeing. So often we'll see people who are white, um, who have a very specific lived experience being the only people whose voices are centered in movements for change in disability work and whose work is profiled and highlighted. So I say intersectionality works across all identities. And for me, it's vital because we don't have time to build community by community. We don't have time to identify barriers and strike those barriers down and then move on to the next community. My thinking is all need to work together from the outset to design not only the solutions for the problems that face us across multiple dimensions, but also dream of a future that's inclusive across all dimensions of diversity. Because I think the idea for so long has been, how do we work together to break down barriers, to fight the good fight? And so much is asked of us to constantly do that. But how can we actually work together to collectively dream of a future that includes all of us? I think there's so much possibility and promise in that approach too.
I love this. And I want to start getting more granular
Yeah.
because next question is going to be about specific things that we can do. And I'm thinking as you're talking about intersectionality, I'm thinking about, for example, when we are doing a session on racial inclusion, or we're doing a session on LGBT, uh, LGBTQ plus inclusion, being intersectional in that we also bring in the experiences of people from different communities that experience disabilities. Or when we're doing disability inclusion focused learning and development, like training,
Yeah.
using examples that put a spotlight not just on professionals that live with disabilities, but bringing in intersectionality, recognizing that if you are racialized, if you are a person of color, you're indigenous, and you live with disabilities, the experiences around inequities and exclusion can be even more pronounced. So is that what you mean?
Yeah, that is 100% what I mean. I think it's threading it into community-specific learning programming. One thing I'll give you that's even more specific. So, for example, organizations will commemorate months of belonging. So, for example, we're currently in National Disability Employment Awareness Month. We have Black History Month. We have Latinx Heritage Month. We have Women's History Month. There's
Exactly.
a space for programming that includes people with disabilities across all of these months. So when we're thinking about the community, think about members of the community across all dimensions of diversity and intersectional identities, and consider whether there's space not just to represent them on one wide scale panel, but are you also able to create opportunities for learning where there could be a focus on what it means to navigate disability and accessibility in the context of racial identity? And think about whether you can create programming that not only speaks to that experience, but helps you think more broadly about the ways in which you can collectively work around community inclusion.